What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Every night before a workday, I set out my outfit for the next day right before bed, and I hang it on a little hook in our bathroom. So I hung up this outfit last night, and I thought, that looks like a therapist recording YouTube content to me. And then I put it on this morning, and I saw myself in the mirror only after I got to work because, of course, I was scurrying to get out the door with my girls to get them to school on time. And once I came to work, I realized I'm pretty sure I had a version of this outfit in 4th grade in like the 90s. And I'm giving like all the Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House on the Prairie vibes. And for those of you who are just listening and not watching, I got like a jumper situation over a short sleeve shirt, and I feel like a small child right now. But you know what? We're going to do it. Anywho, unrelated to that, today we're going to talk about treatment planning. I don't know how I've managed to not talk about this yet. Like, I don't think at all on this channel, except for the episode that I talked about doing your first therapy session. So today we're going to talk a little bit about treatment planning and specifically how I approach treatment planning. I think part of the reason why I haven't talked about this yet is, I'm not an expert on treatment planning. I'm just a therapist who does therapy things. And as such, I utilize treatment planning with every single client that I work with, but I don't feel like, I am the expert who needs to, share my wealth of expertise with you all. But with that said, there are some things that I do differently than I was taught. And I also just don't necessarily always hear folks share these little details. Like, everyone kind of does it differently. And whenever I hear from another therapist bits of information of how they go about different kind of day-to-day things that we do as therapists, I always learn something new. Sometimes I kind of pocket something and implement it in my practice. So that's kind of the idea I have in mind. Like, if we were sitting in a consult group together and we all just kind of shared how we go about doing our treatment planning, and just kind of gleaned from each other's wisdoms. So feel free to chime in the comments if there's things that you do differently than I do. I think that could be especially true across like different workplaces and presenting issues, but also just different therapists and different approaches. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. I think I might just make one extended cut version of the episode this week because I feel like it. Sometimes I'm helped by having a break from all the extra editing. So one thing I like to emphasize as I go over how I approach treatment planning is, one, I'm talking about treatment planning overall as a whole, as a lens, as a mindset, kind of guiding the overall treatment for a therapy client. I'm not specifically just honing in on like how to write your treatment goals in your, paperwork for your client. There are other people who have done that and done that well. Melissa McCaffrey has a lot of great content on her YouTube channel all about it. So I'll link to some of her videos below. If you came here for help writing your treatment goals, she's the place to go. I'm probably not going to super help you with that one on here. And along those lines, treatment planning is an ongoing, ever-present process throughout all of treatment. Like, it's not just a treatment plan that you set on day one, and then that's your plan, and then maybe you revisit it, every few months or so, and then update it as needed. It's this like constant dance in my mind. Like, it starts from the initial email, the initial phone call, and then it's always adapting and changing as we go. That is definitely consistent with what I've been taught over time, but it seems worthwhile to reiterate because I know at least in a lot of settings that I worked in, which has been a long time because I've been self-employed for over a decade now. Oh my goodness. Over a decade. So it's been a minute since I've worked for other people, but in settings where I worked for other people, I guess a long time ago, it can sometimes feel like this is the treatment plan, and then you kind of are sort of sticking to it for at least a good chunk of time, and it's harder to adapt. So just naming that. So given that treatment planning is an ongoing, evolving process throughout all of treatment, the first item I'd like to highlight about my approach is that for me, usually treatment planning starts during the initial phone call. Sometimes the emphasis in the initial phone call is addressing kind of admin type questions. Folks are going to ask things like, do you accept my insurance? And, when are you free? And that sort of thing. But also we're assessing to see, what is it that you're looking for help with? And am I someone who might be able to help you with that? And that requires some level of preliminary treatment planning, because if somebody's coming in with a presenting issue that I'm not equipped to help them with, it's something I'd prefer to catch in that initial phone call rather than meeting with them and then needing to refer out. There's nothing wrong with meeting with someone and then referring out, but if it's catchable in the phone call in 15 minutes, that's ideal, or at least preferable, I guess. I would wouldn't you prefer that if you're the client? Like, you made me come in for this appointment anyway. So anyway, I empathize with that experience because I've been there myself, and I want to try to start a little bit of treatment planning before somebody's even my client in that initial phone call, because if they say enough in the phone call that tells me that, I'm probably not the best fit for them, I want to hear it. On the flip side, I want to hear enough from them that I can give them a little taste of like, yep, we're going to have to get to know each other more, but some of what I'm hearing that you need so far from our initial call is X, Y, Z. Does that sound like what you're looking for from therapy? And if they go, nope, doc, that's not what I was looking for, then that's really helpful for us to know. Or they might say, oh, yes, thank you. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And if I can kind of reiterate back to them what I think I heard them say were their treatment goals, then that often starts to build a lot of trust as well. So it's helpful for a lot of reasons. Of course, the initial phone call is like 15 minutes long. Sometimes mine will stretch into like 20 minutes, but it's short. So we can only just briefly assess. So I will use things like the miracle question, which I talked about, I think in last week or the week before's video, which is basically like, if you could wake up tomorrow and whatever you're dealing with was all better, what might be different about your life? Like, what might look different? How would we know that things were different? Another question that I like to ask is, why now? Because at least most of the time when folks reach out to me for therapy, they've been dealing with whatever their concern is for quite some time, but then there's just something that more recently has happened that's sort of caused this to bubble over and really rise to the surface of like being a more high priority item. So I always like to ask, like, what's happening right now, or why is it that right now you opted to reach out to me when you're saying this has been an issue for a while? There's different stories aside from the like something distressing just happened last week, but often there's something distressing that just happened last week is the most common explanation for why someone reaches out right now. So that gives us a clue into like, oh, this is the thing that made it really bothersome for this client, that made it worth it to them to go through the emotional and logistical hassle of finding a therapist. So that's probably something they're going to want to target if we work together. After that initial call, assuming they schedule an appointment together, of course, that first session is really focused on treatment planning. Like, that is kind of the purpose, the intent of the first session, is to get some baseline of what this client's presenting concerns are, any relevant history they might have, and then establishing treatment goals. It's kind of like the first day of a class or something where the professor hands out the syllabus and is like, here's when your exams are and when your homework is due, and you didn't actually really start anything. It's just sort of like, here's why we're here and what we're planning on doing. Sometimes I re-ask the same questions that I even asked just on the phone call. Like, I might revisit the miracle question. For example, I might say something like, let's say you came to see me for a while and you found our work helpful together. What sorts of things might be different about your life? Or how would we know that you were doing better? Or if folks are pretty unspecific, like they might just say stuff like, oh, I'd feel better, I'd be happier, I'd have more peace, then it might be helpful to ask different questions to get at the answer. So one question that I'll ask, especially if I know that somebody has a close loved one in their life, is I might say, how would your loved one be able to notice that things are better for you after we've been working together for a while? Somehow you end up getting a much more specific answer if you ask that question when they were being vague before. Like, they might start to get at those kind of measurable treatment changes that we're looking for when we're treatment planning. Like, oh yeah, they'd be so happy because I'd be getting out of bed before 10 a.m. or, whatever the things are that are coming up for them. Their partner or their loved one might feel really happy about those changes. And then once I feel like I've identified with the client what sorts of changes would make this client feel like our therapy was successful, then that's when I'm doing some like little computing in the back of my therapist brain, thinking of what sorts of treatment tools I might like to use and that might be a good fit for this particular client based on their history and things that I've learned about them so far that will help them get to those goals. That's something that I feel like I wasn't super taught about. Like, the emphasis was on setting the goals. These are the behavioral changes we want to see, or, we want to see the client be able to get up by 8 a.m. 5 days a week. Let's say that is a measurable, specific treatment goal. We want to work towards that. Great. Also, how do we help our client get there? And I think that part, I hope it's different now. I don't know if it's something about my training. I just feel like that was a little bit more like flying by the seat of our pants. And so for me now, I keep that goal in mind. Let's say it's a goal to help our client get out of bed by 8 a.m. most days of the week, to eventually work up to that. If let's say they're getting out of bed at 2 p.m. right now, great. What sorts of therapeutic approaches, tools, etc., are going to create the baby steps we need to help our client get there? And which version of that is going to be most likely to be successful for this particular client? And for me, in that initial treatment planning, the goal setting part generally doesn't take quite as long to identify. Most of the time, I'm spending more effort and energy in trying to identify what's the best path to help our client get from point A, where they are now, to point B or point J or Z, wherever that they want to get to. And that's where the effort and the creativity comes from. So to me, that's a very, very important part of treatment planning. And I like to begin to start to communicate that with the client before the end of our first session. Sometimes we are still very much in assessment question asking by the end of the first session, in which case I will flag that with the client and I'll say, you know what, there's enough going on here. I don't want to rush kind of setting in stone a plan with you when we're still getting to know what it is that you're looking for help with. So can we have a second session where we continue this conversation before I offer a plan going forward? But most of the time, by the end of the session, I'm able to say, I'm hearing you say you want to work on A, B, and C, your treatment goals. You'd like to get to this specific place. And here are a couple of ways we might be able to get there. And then I will very briefly outline the pathway for how I think this client might be able to start moving towards that. Sometimes that feels very systematic, like when I used to specialize in anxiety disorders. If I had a client come through with panic disorder or some version of frequent panic attacks, we were 10 out of 10 most likely going to be doing systematic desensitization. Like, that is the treatment plan. So sometimes it's pretty cut and dry. There's a lot of things that are like that, but a lot of things that clients are coming in for help with could be approached in a lot of different ways. And even panic disorder doesn't have to be systematic desensitization. I just have built a love for that since I personally overcame panic disorder through systematic desensitization, and it seems highly effective for most people from what I've seen. So anywho, but yeah, if somebody says I would just like to be more in touch with my emotions, and I notice that I'm kind of disconnected from how I'm feeling a lot of the time, and I think that might be impacting aspects of my life. Well, there's probably a whole lot of ways you could approach that. And so then I'd be wearing that lens of what approach is going to be the best fit for this client that I'm also, most able to access as a therapist. And that's going to be most effective to help that client get there and sort of feel like this was successful. Anyway, that was a little bit ranty because at least in my training, the emphasis was more so on the goal setting and a little bit less on the interventions. You need to know what the goals are so that you know what you're treating, but the interventions are really important. I think what often gets emphasized is therapists landing on their theoretical orientation and just applying the same theoretical orientation, I guess, to everybody. And as a decidedly eclectic therapist myself, I really don't have one theoretical orientation, and I'm more interested in tailoring my approach to each client. And I will happily learn new therapeutic techniques within reason if I feel like that's the best approach for a client. I don't know. If I'm sounding real trailing off today, then I don't know, welcome to my thought world. It's nuanced. And the next piece that feels important is once I've laid out one or two potential routes I could take with the client, usually at the end of the first session, then I invite them to collaborate. What do you think of this option? Or does one of those two options sound like it's a better fit for you? We can collaborate, we can adapt it and tweak it. And, a lot of times clients will just say, oh, that sounds great. I'm down for whatever. Let's try it. But if I miss something, there's an opportunity for them to chime in. And I also will say right from the get-go, it's helpful to have a framework to start from so that we know where to go. It kind of gives us a compass and a sense of direction for where to go. But at any point, we can pivot. And often I find myself changing paths with my clients as we learn new things. So let's start with this as our plan, but we can hold it loosely, knowing that as we learn more, you might want to change paths, and that's totally okay. So I kind of name it from the front, and the reason why I name it out the gate is because often the treatment plan changes like big time pretty early on in treatment. This is the part that kind of feels like commentary, I guess, on how we approach treatment planning. It's nuanced. So I'm going to try to explain a nuanced thing and hopefully it makes sense. But whenever you try to insert nuance into something, it's always has room for being misunderstood. So we'll see. We'll see how I do here. But when it comes to treatment planning, often whatever a client thinks they either need support with or what their treatment goals are, or even the best way to get there, are often in line with habits or approaches that reflect how they approach the rest of their lives. Naturally so, because that's how humans operate. So what can happen in the therapeutic process is clients can be invited to deconstruct their default approaches to things in life and then reevaluate them. Say, do I want to keep these things as I have, or do I want to make any changes? And so naturally, as clients deconstruct their worldview and their perception of themselves, it is very appropriate and common for their treatment goals to then change with that change in perception. This is a very tricky thing. There is a fine line here that we're treading on, because as a client-centered therapist, meaning I think the client has within them what's best for them, and they're going to know better than I do what's best for them because they are them and I am not. Did that make sense? I don't know. So client-centered approach, saying client knows what's best ultimately. However, sometimes that client has also had with them habits or approaches that even from their own evaluation, when they're connected to their, whatever you want to call it, their wise mind, their core self, their most integrated self, however you want to frame it, when they're connected truly to themselves, they might actually evaluate their own habits and behaviors and critique them as, not in line with who they really are. So we don't ever want to be in a situation where we create this power dynamic, and then as the therapist, we say, I know what's best for you better than you know. That gets real messy real quick, but we also understand that sometimes the way that our client is approaching things now might not be serving them, and if we help them get to know themselves better, they will then shift what their desires and preferences, values, and goals are, or be more attuned to them, perhaps we might say. I'm going to edit this later and I'm going to go, Marie, there was a way better way to say this nuanced thing that you're trying to say. But this feels really important to acknowledge, because when we set our treatment goals, it's based on where somebody is when they arrive. And generally, most clients are saying that they want help changing something. And often the change is coming from somewhere much deeper than just like, I'd like to wake up on time in the mornings, though that may be a very important marker of their growth and movement towards health. And there might be something going on that's much more core to who they are that they haven't even identified or seen yet. And so the treatment goals might significantly change over time, even really early on, like a full pivot. Okay, I know I just tried really hard to explain this nuance thing, and I'm pretty sure it didn't do a great job. So let me try to explain this with some examples. So let's say a client comes in with a stated goal of dealing with their anger. They might frame it by saying something like, I need to have fewer angry outbursts at my partner, or I need to learn how to manage my anger at work so I can get my work done. And from that lens, we might say treatment goals might emphasize decreasing the client's anger, or at least decreasing behaviors that are motivated by anger. But a lot of times when I see this, I would say more often than not, the client who's asking for help with their anger, saying they're too angry, is often quite justified in the anger that they're experiencing, even if maybe it's misplaced, or maybe the way that they're expressing that anger isn't effective towards reaching their needs or their goals, but the anger itself is appropriate. It is an appropriate response to whatever is happening in their environment. I tried to be specific in specifying for folks who say they need help with their anger, because somebody who genuinely probably has an anger issue may generally be less interested in getting support for it. They might feel that their anger is justified. It's kind of funny how that works. Anyway, I just said a black and white statement, and people are so much more nuanced than that. But in my practice, more often than not, when somebody tells me that they want help dealing with their anger, they're too angry. By the time we get through the thing, usually it's like, that anger has actually served you well and is a superpower. And it's a tie to being grounded in reality. Like, we could just focus on like, okay, how to shift your motivation, be less angry, be more grateful, don't lash out. And we might miss the whole deeper subplot of perhaps this person has been socialized in a context where, because of who they are or something about where they come from, their demographics, they've been socialized to villainize their experience of anger. And so all anger is seen as bad, when maybe their anger is actually supporting them. Maybe their anger is a sign of their health, that they haven't been totally bought into whatever narrative they were spoon-fed. I mean, I think most of us at some point will see a client who's in the situation where their partner is harming them. I'm going to censor this next word because YouTube policies, but their partner may be abusive towards them. And the client, the person who has received this harm from their partner, is coming in saying that they need help with their anger. And if we helped them decrease their anger, we would only be helping them be less connected to reality. So for this client, as you do your work together, they may be able to shift their treatment goals to being able to be more attuned to their anger. Can they understand where it's coming from? Why is the anger coming up now? Does the level of anger match the intensity of the situation? Or is some of the intensity being amped up because maybe there are prior scenarios or filters on that turn up the volume on the anger? And can we bring the anger back to an appropriate level for this situation? Can they learn the correct tools to appropriately respond to the anger? Perhaps behaviors motivated by the anger to seek justice, to seek safety, to seek something that's positive and healthy. Can they identify all of those nuances and feel confident in their ability to sort of navigate all of those situations? That might be the new treatment plan after they get a little bit more in touch with themselves. And that's not to say then that every client who comes in dealing with anger, I just cookie cutter the same approach. I just am aware that treatment plans can change as the client grows, and that may be beneficial and positive and necessary. Typically, after our first formal session and our second session together, I will kick off the session by saying, last time we left off saying that you'd like to work towards A, B, and C, and that we might try using intervention J to help you get there. Does that still line up with what you're looking for? Is there anything else you were hoping to work on that we didn't get to talk about? And this is one of those things where almost everybody at that point just says, nope, that sounds great, and maybe they give some feedback about how they felt better after meeting or whatever it might be. Awesome. And then we're just reiterating our agenda setting. We're on the same page. Cool. But every now and then there's a minority of cases where folks actually had some bigger item, at least for them, some bigger item that they really wanted to work on in therapy, but maybe were too scared or too embarrassed or too ashamed for whatever reasons to bring up in the first appointment. So maybe they brought up some sort of secondary, tertiary concerns that are real concerns for them, but maybe not the core of what's going on. And then when you have this presentation of this question again at the beginning of the second session, for at least some of those folks who feel like whatever they actually want help with is a secret, they will be empowered to bring it up. Let me reiterate, that's not something that happens like every single time. It's definitely a minority of cases, but I want to roll out the red carpet as often as possible for folks to say, oh, actually, there's something more that we didn't talk about. I was a little nervous, but I'm glad you asked. And then after this point, treatment planning continues to be dynamic, but I'm not necessarily like checking in every single session. Like, is this what you want to work on? Is this still your treatment plan? But if I'm seeing flags that maybe it's time to pivot, or, like we talked about in the example with the anger, if we're catching, oh, maybe our perception is shifting around what we thought the issue was or what we thought the goal was. We're learning something new about ourselves or ourselves in the world that's shifting how we approach things, then I'll flag it and I'll say it out loud. I'm noticing that maybe we're kind of reshaping what we're working on. When you came in, you had said that you wanted to work on XYZ, but I'm wondering now that we're talking about this, it seems like maybe you're realizing a different approach might be more helpful. Can we kind of check in and then, we can just redo the treatment planning conversation again and see if it's changed. And then, of course, an important aspect of treatment planning is understanding when treatment is completed. Like, this is like my favorite moment when I'm sitting there with a client and it's, I try to catch it as soon as I can. Somebody has met all of their goals and now it's not just like week 1 of meeting all their goals, but, it's kind of sustained. Maybe they're also like the content of therapy seems a little bit less, like it has a little bit less depth to it, or maybe they don't know what to talk about. Usually around then I'll say, I wonder if this is a good time for us to check in. When we first met, you said your goals were XYZ, or if they've changed, the goals we've been working on are XYZ. And I'm wondering, can we check in? Can we see where you're at with those goals? I try not to say like, hey, it looks to me like you've achieved those goals, but I invite the client to say like, can we check in and go back and see how those are doing? And it's really fun to kind of watch a client go through it and then sort of be like, oh, did I accomplish all those goals? And it's like, yes, I see it too. What do you think? Where would you like to go from here? And that's always a fun conversation to have. Sometimes there's just like, well, let's work on something else. Or it's just a wonderful time for the client to graduate. Maybe we meet one more time after that when we have a booster session at some point. But that is the best feeling. Now, with that said, there are other times where we can see on paper a client has achieved their goals, but they don't feel better. So that's really important to keep in mind that just because somebody has set certain goals, it doesn't necessarily mean that then they feel like therapy was successful when they achieve those goals. And that tells us, if somebody achieves all their stated goals, but they feel miserable or, their life seems to be in, decay or shambles, well, there must be other goals that we haven't yet identified because usually, we're trying to support our clients' overall well-being. So if their well-being isn't supported, we missed something. We didn't catch it yet. We haven't found it yet. So it's important to acknowledge that as well. And this can go both ways. Like I remember, this comes to mind because when you have a baby, they assess you so much for depression, which is the right thing to do. But there's also kind of certain flags that on average are effective in catching depression, but also like you could flag a lot of those things and not necessarily be depressed, or maybe on paper you are depressed, but you might feel fine. So this definitely happened for me when I had my babies, and then I would do the, postpartum follow-ups where I was crying all the time. Maybe not all this. I was crying a lot, okay? And I felt sad often, and I was not sleeping, let's be real. And I forget what else is flagging on there, but enough stuff flagged where they're like, ooh, do you want to see a psychiatrist? And it was always jarring to me to hear that. I mean, by the time I had the second baby, I was kind of expecting it. But initially with the first baby, I thought, but I made a baby and I'm doing it. Like, I feel really proud of myself because yes, I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I'm so sad. The tears just, I don't know, the hormones just push them out. They just come and I feel sad, but I still feel grounded even in the sadness, knowing like, I'm okay. I'm doing this. Like I pushed an entire human out of my body and I'm keeping them alive and I'm alive despite being sad and crying and tired. So like, look at me go. Okay. That was my general mindset postpartum. And like, even me saying those things back, like depending on the healthcare professional, like some people would be like, great, we just have to check, no worries. And other people would be like, well, but the survey says, the questionnaire says you're depressed. And I'm like, listen, I'm telling you, I'm not depressed. I feel really proud of myself. I feel so aligned with my goals in life. And yeah, this chapter is really hard, but I'm doing it. I guess I'm just trying to insert some nuance into the conversation around treatment planning, which I know is really challenging when the systems that be the way that we're supposed to write our treatment plan is not particularly nuanced, if at all. But I just want to insert the nuance in the conversation and have both, right? Like, please don't hear this as me telling you to throw out the Beck depression inventory or, whatever tools you might be utilizing or, your SMART goals that you might be writing, and just supplement. Like if somebody has some flags, let's say on the Beck depression inventory, rather than just saying, hey, you're depressed, it might be a curious conversation. Like, wow, I'm seeing that you said that, you're having a lot of difficulty sleeping or, whatever's flagging. Can we talk about that? Some people might say that this looks like depression, but what do you think of that? And invite your client to share. And it can go both ways, right? They might say like, well, I feel awful. And some clients are so high functioning that they don't flag on some of these questionnaires, but actually internally they are not doing well. So just keep all of these things in mind. And I didn't touch on some of the more core aspects of treatment planning, like making sure that your goals are specific and measurable and aligned with, the things that the person says that they want help with and all of that sort of thing. But there are a lot of resources available about setting SMART goals, which not everyone uses, but I think most therapists use when they write their treatment goals. Again, I will link to some of Melissa McCaffrey's content. She's amazing at talking about all of this and making it feel so accessible to build those goals, put them in your paperwork, and do it in a manageable way. So I'll link to some of those episodes below. Thanks, Melissa. But I wanted to talk about some of these little nuance bits to treatment planning. So I hope it was helpful. I didn't even read. I wrote a script and I didn't read it. I did script more stuff, but it's mostly me rambling. So I think I'm gonna leave it there. And I imagine that treatment planning looks different from, depending on your client's presenting issues, depending on where you work, depending on who's paying for treatment, if there's a third-party payer or if the client's paying out of pocket. And of course, your own kind of preferences, theoretical orientation, all of that as a therapist. So feel free to chime in the comments with what sorts of approaches you utilize with treatment planning. And if it's totally different than what I just shared, that is so okay. So please don't hear this as me sharing the prescriptive way to do treatment planning, because I get that that's not going to apply in every situation, or maybe not even most situations. So I just wanted to share how I have approached treatment planning in my situation. Okay, and before we close, I'd like to thank TherapyNotes.com for sponsoring today's episode. TherapyNotes helps with all of your practice management needs, from scheduling to notes to billing. They have a HIPAA-secure telehealth platform included for free for all users, and so much more. If you'd like to check out Therapy Notes, you can get 2 months to try it for free with no commitment just by clicking the link in the description of this video. All right, sometimes I try to come up with a witty ending and I don't have one, so I think I'm gonna end here. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.